I am Fulya Apaydın. Many of you know, I guess, me from the classes that you're taking here at IBEI. I'm an associate professor here. Our speaker has been involved in actively in the practitioner side of things in addition to his research career. He is currently serving as the Chief Science Officer of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a special professor of international trade and development cooperation at Radboud University. He has a lot of experience working in the field as well, in the DRC in Kenya. He has also published extensively over this topic. This is one of his, I think, this is the fourth book, right? This is the best one. Absolutely. So it is our pleasure to welcome him today to talk more about his findings and observations in the field. And for Discussant, we have Íñigo Macías. He is the research coordinator at Oxfam Intermón, but he's also teaching here at IBEI. So we're really pleased to have him as the discussant today. He has a background in economics, and he's specialized in international development and cooperation with ample amount of, again, practitioner experience in the field. He is interested in the fields of governance, fragile states, economic development, tax and inequality, aid architecture. So we really are looking forward to his take on these key issues. And without further ado, I would leave the floor to our speaker and the discussant to walk us through the key issues in foreign aid and its unintended consequences. Please.
Okay, great, and thanks for having me here, Fulya. I'm really appreciative that I get the chance. And let me start with a small video clip from when I was teaching in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Kinshasa. I was based there for 5 years. Amongst others, a professor at the university there, teaching international cooperation and international development. So it's about 30 seconds, the clip. It says that I've been teaching there for about 2 years. And the topic was South-South cooperation. Is it better than North-South cooperation? So one student arriving late. I let her in. And I'm very glad that I let her in. So it doesn't matter if people turn up late, because this student, her name was Irene. And I asked at the end of the 10 lectures, the 10 weeks, I asked them, do you students think that in the end international cooperation is helping or hindering the DRC? Because there was a peacekeeping mission, there was debt relief, there was humanitarian aid, so many investments of the international community in the country. And then Irene said, yes, professor, I think it's working, all this international support. I said, well, Irene, please, how do you think, can you explain to me, how is it working then? She said, well, my cousin is working for this international NGO, Caritas, and my cousin has been paying my high school fees, has been paying my tuition fees at university, and I have already an internship at the bank right now. And if I finalize my my program, I get a job at this bank. So this is only possible thanks to the salary that he's getting at this international NGO. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So this was not in the theory of change or the log frame of this international NGO, but this was really, the thing that was most important for her. So then ever since I was very much interested in all the unintended effects, all the things that are not in the proposals or the funding documents, but all the other things that's happening. And that's what my book is about. When I was teaching, or when I was doing a same master program as you were doing, a couple of years back, I have to admit, I had people who were very positive about international aid, like Jeffrey Sachs, saying that just give extra money and then all the problems will be solved. And people who are very critical of international aid, like Easterly, saying, oh, it's only money down the drain and let's stop with it altogether. And I hope this book, it's a bit in the middle ground. It's critical yet constructive at the same time. But I do think, and I do agree that there's a lot of side effects related to international development support, and we need to take them more seriously. The positive ones and the negative ones. So what we have seen, of course, is the big scandals in Haiti. Do you know one of the big scandals in Haiti? The sexual exploitation and child abuse by international aid workers. And I think that if we would have taken that issue already much more serious 20 years ago when we had the first stories about it, so child abuse by peace builders and by the humanitarian aid workers, I think we could have prevented a lot of children and the trauma that they have now as a consequence of it. So I think it can really, paying attention to side effects can really prevent damage to human lives. It can also disentangle development dilemmas and pull the emergency brake when needed. You know, what do a lot of teenagers do after they finish high school in the US or in Europe? What would they like to do? They take what kind of year? Yeah, gap year. And in a gap year, often they go on volunteerism. So they travel to nice places, and then they work in an orphanage. Don't worry, they work in an orphanage, but often now the research has shown that often those orphans are not really orphans. You know, they are just being put there from disenfranchised families, and actually it disenfranchises, marginalizes the first families, as we call them, because often they lose their kids. Luckily, we now know that this is happening, so there's a lot of campaigns taking place saying to those teenagers, don't go to those so-called orphanages, because you sometimes if it's not a legitimate orphanage, you make things worse. And the last one, the third reason why I think we should take side effects more seriously is that it really makes the discussion about aid effectiveness and aid efficiency, a more correct one. Now we always try to reduce what we call overhead costs, spend as much money as possible for the target population. But I think, these overhead costs are there for a reason. They are there to make sure that the programs are of high quality and any risks are being addressed or are being reduced. And sometimes if you operate in very difficult environments, be it Somalia or Central African Republic, you need to make sure that all the checks and balances are correctly in place, and that sometimes costs money. So how is this presentation going to look like? I have about 25 minutes left, and you're going to decide what I'm going to talk about. So that's the good news. We're going to vote. I will have the book is a top 10 of side effects, but we cannot deal with all the 10 side effects, so you can vote which ones you think are most relevant for you. So please pay attention, because you will have to vote. But before we get and after the voting and after the explanation of the side effects, we'll look to the solutions, because I think it's very easy to criticize, but I think we should also, there's a big problem with hunger and inequality and climate change in the world, so we need international solidarity. So I'll try to come up with some solutions. But before we go there, let's deal with some of the misconceptions I had when I started this research. And the one is that they cannot be anticipated, the unintended effects. Well, for decades, Spain, the US, Canada, and the EU, we have been giving food aid in-kind food aid to many countries where there was hunger. Do you know what's one of the side effects of this food aid when it's given in kind to hungry populations? I think go ahead, Tyler.
Displaces the local market?
Definitely. So displaces the local market, it disincentivizes local farmers to produce. They cannot compete with this free food which is coming from abroad. So you end up in this perpetual cycle of not enough food being produced locally. So now we have researched this, we know that this is a side effect, so we anticipate this. So that's good news. What we also see that sometimes they can be avoided. So increasingly, how is food aid being purchased? Where is it being purchased? Maybe you know. No.
Usually incentivized by U.S. farmers.
Yeah.
For shipping it over, stuff like that. But you're talking about in the country?
Yeah. So how is it now? Has the World Food Programme started to change its practices?
It's shift to cash incentives, cash vouchers, cash transfers, and then purchase from local farmers.
Yeah. So WFP has been learning from those negative side effects, and now their food aid is totally different than 20 years ago. So they try to purchase more locally, work with cash instead of in kind. So you can avoid negative side effects. It doesn't happen automatically, because there was a big push from Dutch farmers from American farmers to continue with the old system. Because for them it was a nice way to get rid of the surpluses they had, right? It was just basically subsidizing European and American farmers. So the good news is that they can be avoided, but there's often incentives in place within the aid system which make it difficult to reform it. But if NGOs come together and really push for it, change happens. So now, I often thought that unintended effects would be downplayed because of a lot of agencies. When something is going wrong, like in Haiti with the sex scandal, organizations try to minimize those side effects. But then I realize now also there's some other actors who like to make potential mistakes of the aid sector as big as possible. Because they have this preconceived ideas that this charity or this solidarity is only making things worse, you know? They are against all this support, and then if there's a small mistake in the system, they like to explode it. The good news is that most of the side effects are not that negative. There's also many positive spillover effects. And we'll get to that in the presentation. And the last one made my research a bit more complicated, but more interesting at the same time. I always thought that unintended effects would be easy to measure, that they would be, if I conclude that something is a side effect, then it will be a side effect. But what I found out that what is a side effect for us here in Barcelona or in Geneva, at the headquarters of aid agencies, is not a side effect for people participating in the side program, in the program. For instance, a lot of the aid agencies, they try to reduce what they call the sitting fees or the per diems of the local government officials which are part of the program. So often local government officials, if they participate in the training, they get transport costs. And we want to reduce that because we say that's not reaching the final beneficiaries, they are just supposed to implement the program. But for them, actually the reason that they participate in the program is because of the sitting fee that they receive, because their salaries are so meager. So for them, it's very much an intended effect, the international aid program. So it really depends on your perspective. It's all in the eye of the beholder, which, it makes it more of a subjective phenomenon, which makes it a bit more difficult to research. That's what we found out. So, are you ready for the top 10? Yeah? Okay, good. And we're going a bit fast. So one is the backlash effect. So, do you know what happened to some of the Ebola clinics in Western Africa that were being put there? They were being burned down. Burned down by local angry populations saying, you say that you're gonna cure Ebola, this disease, but I think you're making matters worse, so go away to your own country. They saw those white people in white suits, and they were thinking about colonial times, and there was people in white suits testing medication on us that we didn't want. So for them it was a throwback of colonial times, and that's why they were being chased away. But we see it in many places, that Western governments and agencies think that they are bringing something important, but then they are very much chased away. So if you want to hear more about this backlash effect, which is often overlooked in our evaluations, please vote for this one, okay? I think you get the drill. So the conflict effects. This is just one example, is the kidnappings of international aid workers, but especially local aid workers. So many kidnaps are taking place. Why? Because it's providing extra, the ransom that is being paid by the aid agencies and UN agencies, or their insurance companies, to be honest, are actually extra income for those rebel groups, and they can continue their fight with the resources, sometimes from aid agencies. A lot of the funding these days is being used for reception in the region, as we call it, for refugee populations, in the hope that there won't be illegal migration to the US or to Europe. And but now independent research shows that actually if the support that they get, for instance the training or the micro grants, actually are sometimes also an incentive to migrate, because now they have some cash, they have some extra skills, and they're like, okay, let's give it a shot in Europe. So if you want to hear more about those potential migration effects, you can vote for this one. The price effects. I think Íñigo will vote for this one with his economics background. So the new game in town in international development is cash transfers. And I'm all in favor of cash transfers, but what we see is that the measurement often goes wrong. So they measure the results of the cash transfers on the people who are getting the cash transfers, For them, the results are great. I think it's also important to look, what does it do for the neighbors who are not getting cash transfers? And there we see really clear examples of what we call localized inflation. So for them, the eggs and the chicken become much more expensive. So it can also lead to increased undernourishment if you don't pay attention. If you want to know more about those price effects, vote for this one. I think the marginalization effects, there's many examples. I will explain the example of the orphanages. So if you want to hear more subtypes, go for this one. Sorry, it's a bit crude, the picture, huh? Yeah, well, this Dutch cartoons, they're always a bit rude, I'm sorry. They're getting worse during the presentation. Because this one is even worse, I think, but it's reality. So it's the cash transfers. No, sorry, it's the microcredits. I'm in favor of microcredits, but what we do see, if you only measure the results of the microcredits on the economics aspects, you'll see great results. But I think you should always have this broader lens, and if you look at what it does for domestic violence, it can lead to an increase in domestic violence if you don't include the men enough. A lot of men, they're a bit jealous when their wife starts to earn more than they do, and they have a hard time stomaching that. And often they are not good in expressing what they think, and they start to beat their wives. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do microcredit, but you should experiment and tweak and twist your program to see, can I get the economic benefits without the negative side effects with respect to domestic violence, for instance. Okay, I think you've heard it all. The criticism, if you're at a birthday party and explaining that you're interested in international development, your uncle or your cousin will say, it's only leading to corruption. All the aid that you're providing. So, and let me explain the reason behind what many people say, that it has to do with the social contract. So what you see is that, of course, if donors are coming in, they have their priorities, and they tilt the priorities of the government often towards the priorities of the donors. So now the new game in town, of course, is migration management. So we are asking governments of Niger, Burkina Faso, and other countries to build these migration management centers, so the migrants stay there. But the local population, of course, they are not interested in migration management centers. If they could migrate, they would migrate themselves. They want to have jobs, right? So you get this disconnect between what the population wants, what the government is providing, and it erodes the social contract. And then we are surprised that, at one point the backlash emerges, or even coup d'etat enters into place, but that's because the population doesn't feel represented anymore by the government. So if you want to know more about the governance effects, you can vote also for this one. Negative spillover effects, I think, are a very important one and often overlooked, because we often think that we as donors, we know best. We are from the global north and we have to explain to the governments of the global south, you should focus on this, you should focus on that, no. But often donors are also displaying very irrational behavior. We have our sub-themes or themes which we find much more important than other themes, but we don't realize that we sometimes attract then, for instance, if we focus a lot on HIV/AIDS, all the nurses and doctors working locally start to work on this program instead of other diseases, which are also very relevant, for instance, the sleeping sickness. So this is just showing that there might also be negative spillover effects of your intervention if you don't pay attention. Environmental effects, I think you understand. There's a lot of World Bank funding, IFC funding for big roads, infrastructure, airports, important stuff. But of course, it can have an impact on biodiversity or CO2 emissions. Well, do you also measure that? Do you have enough safeguards in place for that? If you want to hear more about that, vote for this one. And last but not least, the positive ones, the ripple effects. We already had the example of Irene, who could study thanks to her cousin working for the international NGO, but we also have the farmers who are part of the program, but the farmers next to these farmers, they see that, hey, this intervention from the aid agency is working, let me copy that. So there's a lot of ripple effects taking place. If you only measure the results for your initial target group, you underestimate the final results of your intervention. And often that's happening as well. So now grab your phones, please, and you can vote which one you would like to hear more about. Gives me the time to take a sip. And the good news is that you can vote for 2 or 3. You can have multiple votes. And I think also the teachers should vote. The professors, I want to hear your... I'm very democratic. Everybody can vote. If you don't have a phone, try to convince your neighbor to vote for you, huh? And if the QR code doesn't work, you can also type in the code. Huh? You go to WooClap and then... It's working? Yeah? Okay, let me go slowly to the results. Oh, look at this. A lot of people interested in the migration effects. Let's take 2. Ah, that's interesting. You're the first group, and I've been teaching for the last 20 days non-stop, who's focusing for the marginalization and for the migration effect. So that's very nice. Let's do those. You're a typical group. Let's go. Is it okay? Or is there any disenfranchised voters who said, no, I'm still in the process? No? No complaints? Okay, good. So let's move to migration and let's move to marginalization. Okay. So the migration and resettlement effect, that's the full title. Unintended migration and resettlements occur when an external intervention creates a movement of population either towards or away from the intervention, whilst this was not the idea of the intervention. They can be voluntary or they can be involuntary. And we'll share the slides, by the way, if you want afterwards. So let me give an example of Madame Messina. And she is living in Cameroon. She was a fish trader. She was a fish trader, I have to say. And we took her testimony. And one way of getting green energy, of course, is building those dams. And she was fishing in a small river, but now with this huge World Bank dam, also financed by some Spanish banks, by the way, her fishing grounds are gone. So she is what we call economically displaced. She cannot do her old job anymore. Luckily, this is a World Bank funded project, not a Chinese funded project, so she gets compensation. But to get compensation, they did a census. And the census, suddenly a lot of people showed up saying, yeah, I used to be a fishing person here. So there was an explosion of people who claimed that they were entitled to some kind of compensation. Then it had to be redone, the census. It took years and years and years. So 4 years after she lost her job, she finally got a compensation, but a one-off compensation. But of course, yeah, she said, yeah, thank you, I got some money, but I didn't get a stable income afterwards. So she says, I understand that the Cameroonians, they need electricity. But yeah, what about me? So a lot of the aid programs, can lead to disenfranchisement of the local population. We have 3 subtypes. Let me go through them rapidly. So they can be aid-induced resettlement. The example of Madame Messina, so it's aid-induced economic resettlement. She had to find another job, but she didn't find another job. But it can also go the other way around, what we call migratory. Aid can also be a push effect for migration, as we saw the cartoon with the guy now having the skills and the tools and some money to migrate, right? So that's the push effect of aid programs. But I think another one that's very interesting is the pull effect, that if the UN starts to base somewhere or starts to distribute food somewhere, you see a big influx of the population trying to benefit from the stability and the funding and the job opportunities provided by the aid agencies. So you see sometimes that leads to an influx of extra population. So what we see is going wrong often in these programs that they measure they do the pre and the post test. But suddenly there's 20% leaving of the people that we're assessing, or there's a lot of people that are coming in, but we are not measuring all the people that are leaving the area or they're entering the area, because we didn't capture them in the pre-test, so I don't know what to do with it, so we're leaving them out. Also the other way around, people leaving the area, we call it attrition rates in development studies, but I think those are often the most interesting people to study. So those are the migration and resettlement effects. Now let's move to the migration effects. Oh yeah, this is a sad story, but let me first give the definition. They occur when an external action contributes to an increase in inequality by weakening or leaving behind already vulnerable groups and by strengthening already privileged groups. So let me give the example of adoption agencies until very recently, until now, international adoption is very much taking place, but we see that actually, just like with the orphanages, often this adoption, those kids who are put up for adoption are not even orphans. So we have a testimony from Sheila and Manoara from Bangladesh, now living in the Netherlands, and they realized that actually their mothers were still alive. They realized it 20 or 30 years later, and they felt that, why am I put in a different country? I experienced racism here in the Netherlands. My mother put me up for adoption, but she thought that it would be just temporary, 4 to 6 weeks, and that she would get me back. She didn't realize that I would move to a different country, but it was just for this period that the mother was in difficulty. So it was really a tough testimony to listen to, but luckily they were reunited after 30 or 40 years with their original mother. But you see that this international solidarity can have some negative side effects if you don't pay enough attention. We call this case the charitable consumer effect. So actually the solidarity is more pushed by the desires of people in the global north to fulfill some kind of, in this case, a need of getting a child, than really helping the first family. If you wanted to help the first family, you would have provided a shelter for this mother for 4 to 6 weeks so she could take care of her own child. So we call this charitable consumerism effect. The second subtype of marginalization is the elite capture effect. It happens when the external intervention leads to an increase in the divide between the well-off and the poor, and that the upper class kind of siphons off the aid. And I think this is not, they over there are corrupt, the leaders, but I mean, we are facilitating. The global north are often facilitating this, right? With our tax havens and our fiscal paradises. This money that is taken away, it's not stashed in local banks, but often stashed in the Bahamas or the Bermuda Islands, and often also going through countries like the Netherlands. And lastly, the regressive targeting effects. I think it's important, especially now we want to attract more private funding into the international development system, because we say, we need to move from billions to trillions. But I think that sometimes with the private actors entering the foreign aid system, we increasingly focus on corporations or on local corporations or local small medium enterprises, which are already relatively well organized and well formalized, and that really the smallest farmers risk being left out, for instance. And we call that regressive targeting. If you are not focused on the poorest of the poor, but this middle group who would probably find a solution anyway. So those are two of the examples. No worries, if you voted for something else, the book is downloadable free, so you can also look at the other ones. And I'm trying to convince the staff here to put it on the reading list, so you get you have to study it for your but you have to talk to them to make it happen. So let's move to the conclusion. So what not to do or what to do. So I think it's very important that what I've noticed in studying for this book, that a lot of the side effects occur when the international development efforts are not really about international development, but about other objectives. If you want just to support a certain dictator because they voted with you in the UN Security Council, if you see that there's human rights abuses or increased authoritarianism, you just look the other way, right? So I think it's really important to see if we can really focus on international development with international development support. It sounds very obvious, but often geopolitics comes in the way, or the willingness to stop terrorism or to stop migration. I think these are all valid aims, but I don't think you should be paying with that money, use development funding for that aim. I do think it's important to overcome some of the boundaries to learning that we have built in our system. There's some personal boundaries to learning because you have been raised and educated in a certain way. You have very deep held beliefs of what works and what doesn't. I also had to throw overboard some of the own preconceived ideas I had. But I think it's even more important, and some of you have already quite some experience in the international sector, that a lot of agencies don't stimulate their employees to think critically and to report critically on what they encounter. They stimulate often their employees just to go with the flow and reward you if you're successful in raising additional funds and if you don't make a total mess of the programming. Whereas I think that you should actually, as an employee, as a future employee, always challenge all the assumptions and the outcomes of your organization. And if you see something that's going wrong, that you should challenge your organization. And in the end, you support your organization more by really strengthening the operations of the organization instead of just pretending that everything is going all right. So you need to overcome some short-term obstacles for the sector and your organization to grow in the long term. We can discuss a bit more. Maybe you already have some experience that you try to flag something in the agency that you've been working for, but that they didn't really take that on board. I think you should try to become... Oh, and the good news is that, of course, there are technical boundaries to learning, but with all the big data, the satellite images, a lot of the effects, the secondary effects, can now be tracked much more easily. So that's the good news. I think technical boundaries can be overcome, but you still have those short-term organizational interests that sometimes make it difficult. So let me conclude. I do think that we shouldn't abolish international development efforts, but I do think that we really need to transform it radically. I do see that there's it's in a crisis mode, in a defense mode. Maybe you've heard it in Spain, but also in UK, the Netherlands. Aid budgets are increasingly being spent in Spain, in the Netherlands and UK itself for reception of migrants instead of really investing in the root causes in Africa or Asia or Latin America. So there's two kind of schools of thought I first. First, some people are just giving up, like, okay, it's too many side effects, let's just stop with international development. Other people say, no, we need to have much more safeguards, procedures to make sure that no risks take place. I think both options are not real options. By giving up, the global challenges from inequality to climate change won't go away. But by having so many safeguards, you risk to end up doing nothing anymore at all. I think risks are part and parcel of international development, especially if you work in very risky places. But it should be calculated risks. And the risk should respond to return. So I think we need to be a bit more nuanced and a bit more humble of what we can achieve with our potential side effects and defend this risk-taking and move forward. So let me conclude. We need to move away from this 20th century top-down linear thinking, which is still very colonialist, and move much more to evidence-based decision-making, equal partnerships, and complexity thinking. Just to explain how this book came into being. So I wrote it, but I had really a group of people who did not look at all like me, who accompanied me in the process, actually, to really make sure that there's a wide gaze that I have and a donor gaze that I have are compensated. There's still some wide gaze left, I think, but it's not because of them, because they try to filter it away. I'm curious to hear Íñigo's thoughts, and you can download the book. We'll share the link where you can download the book. Thank you.
I would like to start with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that I've known Dirk-Jan for more than 20 years now. We studied together. Not only we were in the same course, but we used to be in the same working teams, and we spent hours and hours discussing about the different topics that they were raising during our masters. But I also been working for him. I had the chance to work in DRC when he was leading an international NGO like Search for Common Ground. But in any case, so basically is a close friend in the traditional meaning of friendship, but also I would say buddy, because sometimes we tend to discuss lots of different things from our different respective job places, right? So first, the good things. I would recommend the reading of this book. I actually put it on my syllabus. And there are two main reasons why I think we should all read, if we are interested in development, in development management, why we should read this book. The first thing is because what it is explained in the book. I mean, and he tells so at the very beginning. I mean, he tries to, the book, I think that it successfully helps to navigate this huge gap that exists between deniers and aid supporters, between people like Bill Easterly and Damisa Moyo and others like Jeffrey Sachs. And because, I mean, and actually, I mean, this is what he says initially in the book, but he comes out with a much more nuanced and evidence-based take on this super question about whether we should get rid of aid, we should stop giving aid or not. And I think that in the way, Dirk-Jan seems to confirm and zero in on two basic premises that in my opinion, were long forgotten by these well-known scholars like Easterly and Sachs. And the first one refers to the basic idea that, I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves. Aid will not save any country, right? We have no evidence on that. Actually, the evidence we have on this is that aid can indeed be an important ingredient in helping in helping those countries finding prosperity, development, welfare, helping countries to overcome some of the barriers that prevent them from moving towards that lane where more welfare is achieved in a sustainable manner. But we need to, I mean, we need to be honest with ourselves. I mean, aid is an exogenous ingredient for which global South countries, recipient countries, in need of prosperity, they don't have too much influence, not too much leverage, right? Actually, traditional economic thinking, economic models have found it very difficult to explain why some countries succeed, why others fail. During decades, development theory has been searching for a chimera, for an illusion. What are the ingredients? What's the magic ingredients? And what's the formula to mix them all, right? But without success. And every time we think we have identified this magic ingredient, we discover that this is not something that it can be provided from the outside, but it turns out that the endogenous characteristics of the system itself, right? So we need to operate over those. So in any case, also I would like to highlight that aid is a very precious thing. I mean, it's very precious with a very laudable and a more than welcome purpose in a world where money basically is driven, or money or any other economic resources are basically driven by profitability. And when it comes to profitability, it doesn't mean development or welfare. Aid has to be used for development purpose, full stop. Forget about other additional goals. I mean, but aid has also to be targeted to those most in need with no access to other additional economic resources. And the second issue that I think that Dirk-Jan in his book, he explores pretty well, is that aid interventions, I mean, take very, very different forms according to the different goals they pursue. So the way the intervention is designed must be fit for the goal intended. As such, every aid must be assessed according to that design and that purpose. So I think it is very difficult to come out with an overall answer to the question whether we should get rid of aid, we should keep on giving aid. And I think that what he does in the book is identify these different aid interventions and focusing on the unintended consequences associated with them. Somehow, I mean, I've been trained as an economist, and somehow when I was reading the book, and I mean, it helped me to better understand this idea that it was raised by Esther Duflo. She was awarded by the Nobel Economics Prize, I think it was like 4 years ago, something like that, of this idea of the need to take a sort of like the mindset of plumbers, right? She was referring to economists, but I think that this refers to anybody who is interested in designing public policies. And what does plumbers do? Basically, they try to predict as well as possible what may work in the real world, right? They try to predict as well as possible what they work in the real world. They're mindful that tinkering and adjusting that it is necessary, since our models, right, give us very little theoretical guidance on what and how details will matter. So we have many well-intentioned policies that they fall in practice because of the details that seem irrelevant at first glance. So this idea that we need to leave behind this comfortable theoretical framework to enter to a much more muddy terrain. And I think that he manages to do that in the book. And the second reason I think it is an essential reading is because how it is explained. What is explained, but how it is explained. So he takes a pretty humbler stance, and he's asking for this humbler stance for development practitioners, but he's also very ambitious. He wants us to think about how to promote a better and improved aid sector. And let me quote just a sentence that I think is very, very strong.
With your criticism, okay?
Yeah, now I come with the criticism. But this is a short passage of the book. For those unfamiliar, and I quote, "For those unfamiliar with development studies, the academic backbone of the development sector, there is no other social science discipline as preposterous, absurd as this one," right? It is an initial take of that. However, and it is constantly repeated all along the book, I think that the author doesn't want this book to fill the date bookshelves, right? No, he's exposing facts, he's exposing evidence and research to make aid interventions better. And it is a book that is written for policymakers, practitioners, and evaluators in mind. In each chapter, you will find a section with some learnings for each of these different actors. And also the other thing I like in the way it is being written is that he basically runs away from this sort of like linear thinking. When it comes to development and defining aid interventions, we are all with this sort of linear thinking. And there's been, he departs from this linear thinking to embrace this complexity thinking. And there's been written pages and books about complexity thinking. But most of these pages have been written from a theoretical perspective. And he basically touched base this complexity thinking to reality. And these are my praises. And then what am I missing from the book, right? And I think there are two big things that I'm missing from the book, to be even much more practical. I love this micro stance, this micro approach to the aid interventions, but I'm missing sometimes, I mean, if I were to explain that to policymakers, this is what we do at Oxfam, and I want them to explain. So we don't have hours and hours to talk to them. So we need to get to the point. So I'm missing a link of what is being explained in this book with the aid development effectiveness agenda. You talk a little bit about aid effectiveness in the end, but we have a whole aid effectiveness agenda. And I would like to know more about that, right? But I think that the book, it could basically link all these unintended consequences, what we have right now when it comes to development, the aid development effectiveness agenda. We have ownership, alignment, coordination, things like that. How all those unintended consequences speak to those principles, right? And then something that you somehow raised, but I think that is somehow missing in the book. I mean, and again, and some of my students will talk about that later during this semester, but I mean, we focus on aid. There are so many other policies that affect the global south. What are those policies that go beyond aid, right? What about the unintended consequences of beyond aid policies? You talk about migration, you even say that migration is an intended consequence, but we all know that a proper migrant policy would be even much more better than development cooperation policies. So I would like to hear more about the author. But in any case, I mean, I think I like reading it. I spent lots of nights reading it for the last 2-3 weeks. And I would suggest you to have a look at the book. And then it's pretty easy, straightforward to read. You can even focus on some of the unintended consequences. So in any case, I would say congratulations, but try to improve. Maybe in another book to talk about the unintended consequences of all those development policies that go beyond aid. Thank you.
Thank you.